I'm delighted that Arlene Foster, who is the former First Minister of Northern Ireland, just stepped down in recent weeks. She's decided to give her first interview to Talk Radio to me here this morning. Arlene, good morning.
Good morning, Peter.
It's been a really long road for you politically, and I know that a lot of that has been punctuated by something you're really passionate about stamping out, and that is online abuse. This is something you've dealt with for many years and something that you actually took a court case about recently. Can you just explain to our listeners why you decided to take that court case?
Look, Peter, I think it's important to say as politicians, we have to be challenged. There has to be a space for debate. I'm not sure social media platforms is the best place for debate because it's so limited in terms of the space that you have to do that. But it has become, over the time that I've been using social media, and all politicians have to use social media to get their messages and their policies out there, it became a place where instead of debate, it just became a place of hate, a place of abuse. Of course, not for everybody, but for people who, when you looked into their platforms, they actually only had 2 followers, or some of them had 0 followers. And actually, they had been set up, these Twitter accounts, just to attack somebody who differed from them. So I feel that there's a real need to stamp that out because I actually think it prevents some young people from getting involved in politics and getting involved in public life, which is really regrettable, especially young women. And because of that, I think there's a real need to deal with it. But on a wider issue as well, I have been made aware in dealing with schools across Northern Ireland that it's having a real impact on young people as well. So young people being bullied, they can't escape it when they go home. It's with them in their bedroom. It's with them in their own home. And therefore, these anonymous trolls, anonymous accounts really has to be stopped.
Arlene, it's interesting you mentioned there that it increased, it got worse. Obviously, when you've been a politician in Northern Ireland for many years, but when you became First Minister, everybody knew who you were in Northern Ireland and beyond. And of course, you came to national prominence quite a lot during the confidence and supply deal with Theresa May's government. At what point did it get worse for you? What was the low point? And I wonder, just on a separate point, at what stage does it kind of go from legitimate criticism? You're talking about people having a robust conversation with politicians. I'm going to ask you some tough questions this morning, but also, it goes into actual personal abuse. Do you know, was there a point where that kind of happened, or was it just always the two of them together?
Well, there came a point where I actually stopped engaging on Twitter myself. My staff were engaging on Twitter for me because the abuse was so bad that it was actually beginning to impact upon me. When you read that people think that you should be strung up and killed. An example I'll give you, and it's one, I hope it doesn't offend anybody. When we were doing our press conferences outside during the height of COVID last year, there were some beautiful trees behind us, and we had put up that we were doing our press conference, and somebody said, "Yes, nice trees behind you. You should be hanging from one." This is the sort of thing that goes on all the time. And
Arlene, what was going through your head when you read that tweet? When someone, you either read that yourself or someone brought that to your attention? Tell me about that process of just reading that hate.
Yeah, well, the hate is there, and I think as politicians and as high-profile politicians, we know that. But you asked me, when did it overstep the line? It oversteps the line when it interferes with those you're closest to and your loved ones. That's why I took the case in the High Court, because I fundamentally felt that it was so wrong to make allegations about my family,
so
my family being targeted.
Just for listeners
who prepared to accept that.
Just for listeners who aren't familiar with this was the completely untrue and ridiculous defamatory accusation that you were having an affair. And your husband is not a public figure. He's not someone who gets photographed or comes to press conferences or anything like that. And that obviously affected him, affected your children. What was that like for you?
Well, I have my children range from 21 to 14. They're all active on social media. They knew it wasn't true, of course. My husband knew it wasn't true. But it really got into the space where it was so hurtful, because people were asking questions about our relationship. They were asking questions, and I've said this in court, so there's nothing new. We went to church on Christmas morning. somebody rang up my minister and asked me how our family was at worship on Christmas morning. It became really invasive in my private life and in my family, which I have gone some way to protect over my years as a politician. And I felt I had to act, and that's why I took the case.
How do you protect your family? How do you make sure, you're talking about your children being on social media there. It's easy to find out, if people do a bit of research, what your children's names are, things like that. They're not elected. They're not in the public eye. How do you protect them?
Well, that's so very important because I want them to have as normal a life as they possibly can, being the First Minister's children. And that was tough. But I'm glad to say that most people did respect their privacy, did allow them to do what they needed to do. But it's when people start to send them death threats and say that they hope that they die in a horrible way, you do have to react and you do have to protect. And the mother instinct does come out, Peter, I have to say.
So hold on a second. People were sending your children death threats?
Yes, through my Twitter feed now.
So they were targeting a 14-year-old child.
Yeah, they do. And I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone in that. I'm sure there are many politicians who have that said about their children. I hope your children die and all of this sort of thing. I mean, it is awful. And as I say, at one point, I did move away from handling my own Twitter account because of that. To give myself space, and the staff looked after it for a while. But now that I'm out of local politics here in Northern Ireland in the very near future, I feel I'm going to look after my own Twitter account and deal with it in that way. But I do want to use my experience and my platform, if you like, to try and deal with some of these social media trolls, to try and deal with that peace and anonymity. And I noticed it when the absolute disgraceful abuse was levelled against some of England's footballers last week, the racist abuse that was levelled, that some commentators were talking about the fact that we need to deal with this anonymity piece. So look, I understand there are people who want to use not their own names, they want to use different names for various reasons. Maybe they're in a job that doesn't allow them to express their opinion. But at the very least, the social media platforms should have their identity. Because if they do overstep the line, if they give out abuse, if they issue death threats, then they should be held responsible for that. I feel very strongly about that. And at the moment, the online harm bill, which is going through Parliament, doesn't deal with that anonymity point. I think it needs to deal with that anonymity point, and I'm going to try and speak to the Secretary of State for Culture around that issue.
I was going to ask you about that, actually, because the government would say it is actually trying to deal with this through the online harm bill. That's been in the works for quite a while, and Boris Johnson last week met the heads of Twitter and Instagram and other social media platforms, but you think they should go further in terms of the anonymity thing? I mean, people will say, well, you should be able to express your opinion anonymously online. You shouldn't fear retribution if, for example, your work or someone finds out that it's you, essentially. I mean, do you not feel that is something that people should have at all?
No, I do feel that there should be a space for people to take on not their own name, but a different handle and be able to express their opinions. And this isn't about freedom of speech. I think, Peter, you know me well enough to know that I do believe fundamentally in freedom of speech. This is about actually stopping abuse and stopping harm. I feel very strongly about the need to stop online harm, not just for people in politics, not just for people in public life, but for our young people as well. I really do feel that needs to end, because I have been speaking to some teachers recently and they've been relating to me about incidents of self-harm involving young people. I think that is horrendous and it has to stop. And the only way to do that is to deal with this anonymity point, not stopping people from expressing their views at all. But once you overstep the line, you should be held accountable.
What have you heard and seen in your own constituency? You're in the most westerly part of the United Kingdom in Fermanagh and South Tyrone. You're interacting with people all the time who are talking about this bullying, presumably with children. What's the kind of the cases you've seen? What's the worst that you've come across in terms of online platforms being used to bully children?
Well, you know, Peter, when I was at school all those years ago, you used to, if there was something happened at school that was upsetting, you went home and you were in the safety of your own home and with your family, and that was it. And then the next day it wasn't so bad and you got on with things. With online bullying that's happening now, my children, all of the young people that are about, walk about with their phones, as we all do all of the time. So there's no escaping from the bullying. And I've been hearing about young people harming themselves, cutting themselves to try and deal with these things. And I can't imagine what those young people are going through. And therefore, there is a need for us to take action. And I think the way to deal with it, I welcome the online harm bill. I think it's a good step forward, but we do also need to deal with the anonymity piece as well. And look, I understand this is a global issue. It's not just here in the UK. And in fact, if you look at some of the other nations around the world, they have many, many more users of social media. I'm not suggesting that we don't just need to deal with it here in the UK. It's a global issue and it needs to be dealt with globally.
Arlene, you are someone, obviously, who was a very, very well-known politician, still are a very well-known politician, and you are going to have a megaphone to go around the world to talk to people about these things. Is this going to be a big issue for you? Is this going to be something you're going to be pushing in your sort of post-politics career?
Yes, most definitely. I hope to use my experience and the way in which I'm known in certain areas to deal with these sorts of issues, because obviously I can bring my own experience of how it has impacted upon myself. But more than that, I do want to be a voice for people who really don't have a voice, like our young people, like women in public life. I really want to be able to say to these social media companies, there's more that you can do. I think social media is a wonderful platform. It allows us to share and connect and communicate with people right across the world. But there needs to be a way to regulate the abuse and to regulate the harm. And why wouldn't you want to do that? And I hope the platforms do step up.
What is your message to someone who might see a politician or someone in the media or a public figure of some description who says something they disagree with, who might be tempted to send something which oversteps the mark? Talk to those people directly today and tell them what you think, Arlene, having been through this.
Well, I think sometimes when the public look at politicians, they don't actually recognise that they're human beings with families behind them. I have an elderly mother who's 88 next week. I have children. I have a husband. I have friends who are very close. And to be sent death threats in that way does really have an impact upon you. It has an impact on your family. And I really despair the fact, Peter, and this is something I feel very strongly about as well, I despair the fact that we cannot have open and full debate without resorting to abuse and without resorting to death threats. Whatever happened to civilized debate? Whatever happened to agreeing well? In other words, you might hold a very clear policy that I fundamentally disagree with, but where is the need to send you a death threat because you disagree with me? You know what I mean? There needs to be a stepping back into a more civilized debate. And if I can try and engender some debate even around that issue, I think that will be time well spent in the coming months and years.
Arlene Foster there. I just have one more question for you, Arlene. Obviously, you stepping down was something that was quite a brutal process. Now Jeffrey Donaldson MP is leader of the DUP. What is your message to him? What do you think he should do as the new leader of the DUP?
Around social media or around generally?
In general.
It's a rather open-ended
question. It is pretty open. In general, what should his priorities be?
Well, leading the DUP is a huge privilege, and I was very honoured to do it for 5.5 years. And I had some really wonderful times, but some very, very challenging times as well. And I think you know that, Peter. So for Jeffrey, there are some big things in the in tray, not least some of the things you've been talking about this morning around COVID and how we deal with that moving forward. There's the whole issue, which has been very topical over this past week, around dealing with the past. And since 1998, when the Belfast Agreement was signed and voted upon, there has been a real gap in what happens in Northern Ireland, and that has been around how we deal with innocent victims, because they weren't dealt with during the Belfast Agreement time. And as a result, we have this very, very difficult conversation going on at the moment around legacy. And Jeffrey has a huge challenge around that as to how he leads not just the Democratic Unionist Party, but all of the people that vote for us and those people in Northern Ireland who will look to him for leadership on that issue. It's a hugely difficult piece. But I note today, Peter, that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has written a piece in the Daily Telegraph where he says, if anybody has any better ideas as to how we should deal with it, as opposed to what he has put forward this week, then please come forward. So at least there's a willingness to listen to other solutions to dealing with the past, and it is a gaping hole that is there at this present moment in time.
Absolutely, and we're actually going to talk to the former head of the Army, Lord Dannett, about that a little bit later in the programme. Arlene Foster, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you staying